Okay, so more arrays. Today we're going to talk about two main things. One is what other things can arrays do, and the second one is this idea of nested arrays. Okay, so continuing with yesterday's themes of kind of fancy built-in tools that JavaScript already gives you for arrays. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was the idea that with any of these methods, you want to be really careful about whether or not the function is going to give you back a new array, in which case you need to be capturing it somewhere or using it directly, or if it fundamentally changes the original array. So yesterday we talked about something like dot pop, right, or dot reverse. And I threw a word of caution out there was because those are the functions that actually change the original array. So if on line 1 you do a dot pop or dot reverse, on line 3 if you try using that function or if you try using that array again, you just got to kind of keep in mind that it has already been fundamentally modified. Dot splice is another method that does something very similar in terms of in that it does also mutate the original array. Yesterday we had something called dot pop, dot push, dot shift, or dot unshift, and those basically allowed you to add or remove things from the beginning and the end of the array. Dot splice is very similar in the sense that it also adds or removes things from an array, but it does so from the middle of the array. So rather than doing it from the ends, we go through the middle. Dot splice takes in a few arguments here. The first argument is a index, and so this basically tells you, if I was going through the array, where am I starting, right? That's the start point. The second argument that we usually feed into slice is how many things do we want to take away from this array. So if I do names.splice 1 1, what that means is I want to start at index 1, which is this John element in the middle here. I want to take away one thing, and also what then dot splice gives back to me is all the things that I just removed. So remember how dot pop yesterday removed something from the end of the array, and it only removes the very last thing from the array and gives it back to you. Dot splice is actually very similar to that, except one, it removes from the middle, and then two, you can actually specify how many things you want to remove. Look at it for now. Make sure you kind of understand kind of conceptually what it's doing, and then when you start using it, refer to documentation, and it'll be a lot better way for you to get familiar with this particular method. Oops, sorry. Ugh. Okay, so same thing here, right? If I was to say, hey, let's have the four members of the Beatles. Let's start at index 1, which is George, and let's take away two things. Then I'm taking away both George and John, so the two middle elements. And once again, my original array is now shortened by two elements. Yeah, Jillian? That's a really good question. Let's check. I'm pretty sure you could, because JavaScript's arrays the index are pretty fluid usually. So if I have something called let names equals, well, let's do A, comma B, comma C, comma D, right? And so you're saying let things equal names dot splice. And did you want to start with a negative index here?
Or no, like start with index 3 and then move the thing in front of it. So like you start with C,
Oh, I see. That's a good question. So here, if I want to, let's say, remove B and I start a C, I'll start a C and I would do -1. Let's see what happens. Any guesses? I actually don't know the answer to this. We'll find out though. Undefined. When in doubt. All right. It does not work, unfortunately. I'm sorry. It looks like names is not being changed. If we do 1 just to prove, so C gets removed. But if we start as C, I don't think it looks like it won't let us remove the element before it. Now let's do the other thing, which is, hey, let's go to -2 and remove one thing from it. Does that work? That does work. So it looks like the way that splice. Oh, sorry, you realize how small it was. It looks like what splice does is in the first argument, because you're specifying an index, I was telling someone this yesterday. Indexes are fixed, right? If I give you an array, that element is always going to have an index value, and that index value is going to be fixed. So I can specify any index, and JavaScript has no problem finding it. I think the idea is when you do negative numbers, like we say, hey, take away -2 things. I think that conceptually gives JavaScript probably a little bit of trouble. So that's why, or maybe they just don't want to write it that way, right? So that's why this second thing has to be positive, but the first one can be positive or negative. If you do a negative index of an array, by default, it just starts counting it from the back, right? So if you do array index -1, it just says, hey, give me the last thing. Or, yeah. Actually, let's just double check to be sure. Oops, that's not right. Wait, no. What am I doing here? Scratch that for now. Yep. But I guess with the dot splice, at least when you tell it where to start, if you give it -1, I think it's smart enough to start counting from the back. And let's just make sure that that's indeed what's happening here. If I do a -2, then it starts -1. It's second from the end, so a C, and it takes away one thing. So that looks right. Okay, cool. Any questions on? Yeah, Neil? Yes. The element that you start at, that's the first one that gets taken away. Right. So if we start at, let's say, 0, and we want to take away 1, then it should be the A. Yeah. The inclusive exclusive thing between splice and slice actually gives me trouble too. So often, a lot of times, like a lot of these questions you're asking are all really good questions. And honestly, repo is like by far the best way to just kind of like figure out right away if it does it or not, right? Rather than memorizing all these kind of somewhat arcane rules. And also there are rules that may change over time too. And so really like, if you want to know kind of what happens, just try it out. Okay, cool. So that's the splice method here. And then this is something that like you might have noticed a little bit already in the way that we do things. But a lot of functions can take several arguments, right? But we actually don't need to give it, the max number that it has to take. So with splice, it can actually accept up to 3 arguments. We'll talk about what the third one does really quick. But if you notice how earlier what we were doing is we were calling splice was just 2 arguments, and the function worked fine, right? And so this is kind of like a key in a thing in JavaScript, whereas a lot of functions can take up to multiple arguments because it has a lot of different functionalities. But if you don't want to utilize it, you can just leave it blank. What you cannot do is say, hey, this thing takes 3 arguments. I only want to utilize the first and third argument. I'll just skip the second. Then you actually need to put a placeholder in the second argument so it knows that this is the first one, this is the second argument, and this is the third argument. So because of that, we want to be a little more careful with it. But anywho, we did mention earlier that splice can also add things to the middle of an array, and so the third argument is reserved for the things that you want to add. So in this case, what we actually want to do is, if we read this, names.splice, right? We're starting the second index, which is Paul, George, and Pete. So we're starting at Pete, right? That's the index 2. We take away one thing, which is going to be Pete. And then we want to add in one more thing, which is Ringo. So we're going to insert it there instead. Realize that like it's a little bit confusing in terms of thinking about it, but like it's like I know Pete already got removed, so technically like John's index 2 now. But really what we're saying is, hey, insert this at index 2. As in whatever this is going to be the new index 2. So you can think of it as like we're putting an index 2, and then everything that was in index 2 like before gets shifted down 1 now. We kind of just like shove it in the middle there, and everything else kind of flows to the right. Similarly, if you want to do something like this, if you want to add more than one thing, we can do the same thing, right? In this case, what we're doing is 2, 0, so we're actually not removing anything. But remember, we need this 0 here, right? The 0 is super important to us because once again, JavaScript says, hey, you can have multiple arguments if you want, but like it has to be in the correct order, right? So we need to know how many am I taking away. If I put Pete here, it will probably yell at me and throw an error saying, hey, that's not a valid number or something like that. So even if I'm not taking anything away, I still need to be very clear with splice saying, hey, I don't want to take anything away. I just want to add, in this case, 2 more names here. And so in this case, if we want to add 2 more names here, Pete becomes a new index 2, right? Because we want to start at 2. So Pete becomes a new index 2, and then we're also inserting these things in sequence from our start point. So Pete and Stuart becomes a new indexes 2 and 3 respectively. And so by the end of it, we have a list of 6 things now. And if you notice, we actually also capture our removed elements, which is an empty array, right? Because remember, Splice will give back to you an array of everything that was removed. Even if you remove nothing, Splice still wants to tell you, hey, I did my job. I didn't remove anything, just like you asked me. So it will still give you back an empty array. So just kind of be aware that doing nothing is somewhat of like a human term, and a computer will always return something back to you. If you ever write a function, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about functions. If you ever write a function and you don't give it a return value, the function is still going to return something. It will return undefined. A lot of times when you were doing the workshop problems, a lot of times you would get back undefined. You might be wondering where that comes from. Well, if you write a function that only console log stuff but doesn't ever return anything, that function is still going to return undefined. And so that's why it's really, really critical whenever you look at a function to understand what is not only what it's doing, but what it's giving back to you. Okay, any questions about Splice? That's probably like Splice is going to be as tricky as we're going to go in terms of array methods. It's definitely a powerful method. It's one that I still, whenever I use, I probably look the docs just to be safe. Yeah. Everyone feel pretty good about Splice? Yeah, Leo.
This one does change the original array.
Yes, yeah. Splice definitely changes the original. Nope. Splice changes the original array, or we call it it mutates the original array. It's a muted function. Cool. All right, the next one. Oh, sorry. Let's do this again. Next one is the join method. This one is something that I think we used maybe a little bit before when we were doing the capitalized letters, or at least when I showed you the quick way to do it, I used the join. Join basically takes an array and joins them for you into a single string. So usually this is pretty good for translating all the elements together in the correct order into a string. Join takes in one argument, and that argument is going to be whatever you want to kind of be the separator between the different elements in the string. So a very common. So if I just do this array dot join, if I just do array dot okay, sorry. So if I just do this names dot join here, and I put this space and space, what it'll do is it'll say, okay, Paul, George, John, Ringo. Let's make that one complete string, and then between each string, let's put this space and space, space and space, space and space. So basically, if you want to have any custom things here, that's how you would do it. Sorry, one thing I'm also really checking in really quick is just to make sure that cool. Yeah. So notice the what I want to make sure was just like by default it is a comma that's being put in there, but no spaces around the comma. Or so it's just like element A, comma, element B, comma, element C. I just want to make sure there was not a space before I told you when I know there was a space. Cool. Okay. Next one. Okay, dot concat. This basically is just a way for us to shove two arrays together. Usually the way that you do it is like the first array calls dot concat, and then you pass in the second array into the concat function. So in this case, if you want to join this, I guess older and younger array, the older array we call dot concat, and we pass in the younger array. And what it will do is it will take the old array. It will take the original array, the one that calls it. That order won't change, but it will just basically shove the new array until the very end of it, right? So think of it as we're just taking each element in the second array and just pushing it onto the end, right, in the correct order. So when we combine these two, we now get an array with all 4 people. But this also, notice this keyword here, it returns a new array. This also does not change the original array. So whenever we use this, if we do decide to join two arrays together, we need to have some variable to be able to store that new array. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully these are all things that, like, if you think about it for like, if you think like, oh, that makes sense. You assume, and like there's probably something that allows you to join arrays. Probably something that allows you to take things off, add things into the arrays at different intervals. So hopefully nothing too complex there. So those are the three last kind of more commonly used array functions. I guess the most important thing for them is for now at least, like feel free to use them. They'll be very powerful tools. They'll be very easy. They'll make it really easy for you to do a lot of things. But they're also not like kind of like you can also write your own versions of them, right? Like if you say, hey, splice just is really, really tricky, or dot concat is really, really tricky, and for now I just want to do everything myself, use for loops to iterate through it, like that's totally cool, right? Once again, these are all just tools to make your life easier. If at some point you say, I want to do it in my own way or with a different implementation, feel free to, right? If you don't want to use it, don't use it. None of these are things that you cannot reproduce on your own. And really the point of the workshop is for you to get comfortable with it, to be able to reproduce it on your own if you want. Okay, so lastly, or the last kind of main topic we'll talk about arrays is this idea of nested arrays. So as I'm sure some of you might have seen already, an array can hold any data type. It can hold strings, numbers, objects, whatever you want. It can also hold other arrays. And the reason why that's really powerful is because, or not powerful, but well, it is powerful. But one of the reasons why that's really important for us to be careful about is whenever we access an array, we always want to be sure like we're accessing the right thing, right? So up until now, whatever we've given you an array, it's been an array of numbers, right? So no matter which element you're taking, you can pretty be sure that it's going to be a number, right? It may be the wrong number, but you're still getting a number. Now, because we have arrays nested inside of other arrays, we really want to be careful when we access it that are we actually getting back the thing that we want to be getting or the thing that we think we should be getting. So, looking at this nested arrays here, right, we have a list. And in this list, there are how many things? 2, right? There are 2 things. And the reason why is because if you think about it from a computer standpoint, this first thing, that's just a list. However many things is in that list, it doesn't matter, right? Because the JavaScript in the array is like, hey, your first thing is going to be this list of 40 other things, but that's not the outer array's problem. The outer array says, great, you're giving me a list. That's cool. That's all I need to know. Nothing else really matters, right? It's a list, so it's one thing. Same thing with the second thing. It's another list. It's another array, right? And so in this case, as far as the outer array is concerned, I have 2 things. They're both arrays, but I only have 2 things in my array. So that's why when we access it, when I say, hey, this first outer array is called related things. If I say, hey, give me the first thing in this array, it's going to give me back another array, right? Because my first item is just an array. Cool. Similarly, if I skip to line 7 really quick, if I ask you, hey, how many things are in this array? It will say 2. I have 2 things, right? It's 2 arrays, but it's still just 2 things. So that explains the kind of line 5 and line 7. Line 6 is kind of like the focus of this part of the lecture, at least, which is hey, how do I access like things in the inner array, right? Or how do I access things that are nested, basically things that are embedded in each other? And I mean, the answer may or may not kind of be giving it away here, right? But really, remember how earlier when we were doing math, I was like, JavaScript evaluates from left to right, right? We do the first thing, then we do the next thing, then we do the next thing, then we do the next thing until we reach the end. This is the same exact scenario here, right? If I was to say, hey, related things, give me your first element. If I cover up this part, it says just give me your first element. It's going to give me this array that says New York, Chicago, right? It's going to give me an array. So if this first part gives me an array, how do I access elements in that array? Well, I'm going to access it the same way I access any element in the array, right? I'll just throw another bracket and say, hey, give me whatever it is that you provide. Give me your first element. And so that's why I can just kind of put these bracket accessors in sequence. because each thing before it is going to give me something that is going to be able to that I'm going to be able to access, right? So reading at line 6 now, what this says is, hey, this massive nested array, give me your second thing. Give me the thing at your index 1. And that will be another array. So we can replace everything with here with an array. And then we're saying, hey, this second array, give me your first element. And we do. And that's how we get to New York. Yeah, Theo?
Can we add a third bracket with the first letter in the string new?
Yeah, totally. So really quickly, remember how earlier when I was saying how does a computer know whether or not you can do something? And the answer is it doesn't know beforehand. It just tries to do it, and if it fails, it will tell you, "Hey, I failed. This thing broke." So if I just go back to the example here, then if I put, for example, like if I have something like this, right? How long is my array? 2. Yep. So right now, my array has length 3, right? It has 3 things. It has a string for the first thing, an array for the second thing, and then a string for the third thing, right? Just 3 things. And then I guess, okay, so I think Leo's question was, hey, if I do something like, let me make this a word. Okay, so this will be index 1. That gives me that inner array. And then I say, give me this. So now I'm at a string bat, right? And Leo's question was, hey, can I add one more thing to it if I want a given letter to it? And yeah, if I want, let's say the second letter, I want the A, I can just access this, and that'll totally work too, right? Because once again, at every single interval, what this JavaScript is saying is, hey, what's names? And it'll say, oh, names is an array. Cool. Okay, so let me try doing names index 1. Actually, I'll just do it here. Okay, so how if I was to deconstruct line 7, it basically becomes sorry. Okay, it basically becomes that at first, and then if we start solving this out, then it eventually becomes this. Make sense so far? Yep. And then this eventually becomes this. And then that eventually, well, and then that eventually becomes just that. Cool? So at each sequence, we're doing it. Now the question is, what happens if I put another index 0 here after it? I'm sorry? Undefined reference error. Okay, so undefined reference error. Anybody think of anything besides undefined or reference error?
The value itself, maybe? A?
The value, it will give you back A. Okay. Any other guesses? It will give you like the type, so a string. Cool. Okay. So I mean, I guess I solved it. I kind of really painfully like laid it out here, right? Everything before this 0 is gonna give me what? And what type is A? It's a string, right? With one letter, right? Great. And then so then what is this trying to get now?
Oh, it's the first letter, so it'll just give you A.
Right. This is just saying, hey, give me the first letter in the string. And it'll give me back what? Cool. And so one of the things we'll notice here is that actually, because this is a string with at least one letter, we can just actually type this infinite times. And each time, it will just give us back another string with one letter. And as long as you say, give us back your first thing, it will say, great, here's your string. Great, here's your string. Great, over and over again. So if I run this, that's perfectly valid JavaScript, right? I'm just accessing this same letter over and over and over again. But, I mean, hopefully this is trying to prove the point that, one, there's no limit to the level of nesting, right? You can nest to your heart's content. It becomes hard to access as a human after a while, but a computer has no problem going through it. It'll just crank through it as often as you want it to, right? Secondly is, whenever you're trying to access things by index, think about what the prior value is. And if it's a string with a letter, yeah, go ahead, access the first index, right? There's nothing wrong with it. You're not doing anything wrong. You're abiding by the rules of how strings work and how indexes work. Now, what if I was to not do that? Instead, I was to do, oh gosh, So everything up until now is going to give me the letter A, and now I'm saying, hey, give me the second, the second element or index 1 of your string that only has one thing in it. Now what do I get? So reference error. No. Oh no. It's like a no. Yeah. It gives back undefined, right? Because what it does is it's saying is like saying like, hey, yeah, you have a list. You can hold as many things as you want. You just haven't told us what it is yet, right? So these are just kind of some of the things that you'll find. Oh, cool. One more thing. So if I access a letter that's not there, it gives you undefined. So if I access it again, if I say, hey, now give me back the first letter, what do I get here? U? U? Well, no. So that's one guess.
Okay.
One guess is the letter U. Any other guesses?
Really?
Undefined again. Okay. So U, undefined. That's it. A. Okay. Just pick a letter at random and just throw it out there. So you get. Cool. So okay. So let me just do this here. So if I console log, I'm just gonna actually I'm gonna do it here so we can all see it really clearly. Okay. So we're getting rid of the console log now. It doesn't really matter as much. Okay. So if I do this, let's just assume that everything up until here is going to give me the letter A, right? And then we've already established that, hey, if I want to access a letter that's not there, it gives me back what? Yeah, this is going to result to undefined. And now really the question becomes, what does this resolve to? Yeah, I'm surprised no one said error of some sort, because now it's an error, right? And the reason why is this, okay? Can I access an array with bracket notation? Thank you. That was a little scary. Yes, I can access an array with bracket notation, right? Arrays are built so that I can access bracket notation, right? What does it mean to use bracket notation on undefined? Sorry? Right. Or exactly. So normally we need an array or a string to use bracket notation, right? In this case, what we're doing is we're actually telling undefined, hey, I want to use bracket notation to access you. And undefined's going, what? Right? Like what are you trying to do? Like, I don't accept bracket notation. It's not a thing to me, right? Like, I don't recognize it. Like, you might as well just say undefined.splice. And I'll be like, that's really cool, but I don't know what that is, right? It doesn't, conceptually, it doesn't exist for me. I don't have bracket as undefined, I don't have bracket notation. I don't have splice. I don't have all these fancy things. And so that's why we get the error now. Is because now we're trying to do something that violates the fundamental rules of JavaScript, right? In JavaScript, undefineds do not have functions, right? If I have one string, I can use bracket notation to my heart's content. If I have an array, I can use bracket notation to my heart's content. If I have something that's not an array or a string, and I try to use bracket notation, JavaScript will say, okay, now you're doing something that I don't allow, or rather, I don't have any way to implement this. And so that's why a lot of times this is like a very common. Sorry, I keep forgetting this error shows in red, so you can't really see it that clearly. So this is called a type error, and the error actually is pretty straightforward. It says cannot read property 0 of undefined, right? Basically, it's going undefined saying, hey, give me this property. You're trying to access a 0 property, and undefined's going, I don't even know like what that means. So we have this error here. So a lot of times when you see this error, it usually happens like much further downstream of this. Because remember, you can access, quote unquote, access an element that's not there. It will give you back undefined. It won't error then, right? But then if you try to do something with that element, usually that's where the error gets thrown, right? If you say, hey, I'm going to assume that everyone's going to give me back a string, but then you're wrong and it actually gives back undefined. If you try using it like a string later on, usually that's when the error happens. And so I'm just going to throw a quick kind of caveat or a quick warning out there. It's like a lot of times when you see this error, like really try to understand what the error is saying. But just because the error occurred here doesn't mean like that's the root cause of the error. Cool. So everyone feeling okay about nested arrays and kind of how we use bracket notation, right? We're just traversing through it. At each step, you just got to know what the previous thing is actually giving back to you, and then if it gives you back, or rather whatever it gives back to you, feel free to treat it like it came like brand new, right? Without getting it through the nested functions. Okay, so that's where we're here, and then same thing here. If I want to, okay. Okay, so what this kind of hairy function is doing is it's actually going through. Sorry. What this function is doing is it's basically going through, and if you can tell on the right hand side, it's actually printing every single name in the array. If I was to just print this out normally, right? So assume lines 4 through 11 really didn't exist, and I was just going through this array with a typical for loop and saying, hey, print out for me each element. Guess what? What's the first element that's going to print out?
The first array, Jane Mill.
Right. The first thing will be an array. It won't be the name Jane. It will be an array with two things, one of which happens to be Jane, right? But as long as JavaScript is concerned, without lines 4 through 11, the first thing that it prints out is going to be an array, right? Instead, what these middle function is going to do is it actually does it, and on line 5 there we see this is array thing again. It actually checks for each element to see if it is an array. Okay, if it is an array, then we see this inner for loop that actually goes through that inner array and goes through it again and prints out each name individually. And if that element is not an array, then we'll just print it out here on line 12 like we have historically, right? And so by doing that, we're actually now able to not only print out things at like quote unquote the outermost level, we can go in as deep as we need to print out things inside the inner arrays as well. So just to kind of walk through this, fairly quickly here. Line 3, right? We go through the outer array for each element. Line 4, we just create a temporary element, or sorry, a temporary variable called element, and that's going to be that thing. And we say, hey, if this element is an array, let's loop through that element and print out everything. Okay. Otherwise, if it's not an array, which means that it's a string, then just print it out. And now this will actually allow us to print out every single name in this list, regardless of whether or not it's nested.
So dot is array is a conditionality that tests if it's an array and it yields true.
Yep.
Okay.
Array.isArray is something that I think is on Saturday or whatever. But yeah, it's a class function on the array class that basically you pass it in something, and it'll return a boolean for you, yes or no, is this an array?
Okay.
Cool. So this is basically the most fundamental way to access a nested array, right? Is you just got to write these for loops over and over and over again, which can be tedious. And so one of the problems we'll face tonight is also to figure out, hey, is there a better way to do it? And we'll touch upon this again near the very end when we talk about recursion, right? Like, what if this array was infinitely nested? How do we figure that out? So for now, at least, just kind of bear in mind that these things do exist and they're very tricky, and you can't just treat accessing a nested array is very different than accessing the outer array, right? Like JavaScript is very specific about how you can access each one of those things. Okay. So here is something that is kind of more. So I'll talk about grid, and then we actually have an optional project for you to do as well, if you want to just practice more with arrays, because who doesn't? So one of the ways that we can think about using an array is to actually, one of the ways we think about using nested arrays is to represent a grid, right? In this case, between lines 7 through 11, we added some spacing to make it look a little prettier, but essentially, a nested array can be used to represent, in this case, a 3x3 grid, right? We have an array with 3 things, which could be 3 columns, right? 1, 2, 3, or I guess depending on how you want to frame it. But essentially, I guess each thing is a row, and each row has 3 things, so it would be 3 rows by 3 columns, right? So we can write this out on one line as well, but the way we space it here is just so for you to get comfortable understanding that this can also be shown as a grid. And so then when we think about kind of accessing these things, it's conceptually the same thing as what we just talked about, right? If I know grid is going to be a nested array, I can do grid, index 0, which is say give me the first row, and then index 0 again, give me the first column. So this basically asks for the value in the top left hand corner, right? Top because I want the first row, and then left because I want the first column, if you will, right? And so if you notice, what we're actually doing here is this is going to give me back a value, right? A number. This is going to give me back a number, and this is going to give me back a number, and we're actually storing all three of those values in another array. And once again, this is a totally fair way to create an array, right? I have my square brackets, I have a comma to separate each value, and I'm giving you a value. So it's a totally fair way to create an array. And now what they're trying to do here is they're actually basically recreating the first column by asking for, hey, in the first row, what's the first column value? In the second row, what's the first column value? In the third row, what's the first column value? And creating kind of columns in that way. So there's obviously a lot of ways for you to play around with this and kind of and get familiar with it. But nested arrays do have a lot of powerful properties beyond just necessarily just kind of the things we've talked about so far on a more straightforward basis. Cool. So that's arrays. So that's a few more methods than nested arrays. One thing I'll also open up for you guys is a Sudoku project. Everyone here knows what Sudoku is, right? Cool. I mean, that's. I think the project is pretty self-explanatory. But it's 100% optional. And the reason why we make it optional for you guys is just because so the room next to us is they're doing the month-long version of this, so they have a little bit more time. For us, because we are so cramped, it's completely up to you if you want to do it now or do it after the week is over when you have more time to, you want to focus on the core materials for this week at least. So completely up to you. You'll have access to the workshops, to the code, even after this week is over. So feel free to take this kind of at your own discretion. I'll review the code if anyone has any questions, but obviously, no need to submit anything or anything formal. Any questions on nested arrays, array methods, really anything to do with arrays? Right?
Just to clarify the point about how some, that Leo was bringing up, how some array, they're taking the original array and modifying it. They're not creating a new array.
Some methods modify the original, some create new arrays.
Okay, yeah, you have to know that because if you're creating a new array, then you have to create the variable that sets new array and then kind of solve for that later on or return that later on.
Yeah. So if a function is giving you back a new array and you want to keep it, you got to store it somewhere, right? So you guys got to be aware of that. If it mutates the original array, then you don't need to explicitly store it anywhere because it's already being stored as the original under the original variable.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Where is that project?
Sudoku. I haven't opened up yet, but I will. Yeah. It'll be a pain, like everything else is. All right. Any other questions? Something happening over there?